So today we'll be talking about Chapter 7, Section 4. And the title of this is States' Rights and the National Bank. See, Andrew Jackson confronted two very important issues during his presidency. The issue of states' rights. Remember the division between Federalist and Anti-Federalist. It's going to become the Civil War. The division here is how much power should individual states have. Originally, they were like countries. And then becoming a nation, states had to submit to the will of the federal government. Yet, a country giving up its sovereignty to be part of a bigger country is problematic. I mean, how do you feel about a world government? Anybody ever thought of that? The Great New World Order, that's the bad guy in a lot of sci-fi movies. A world government makes many of us uncomfortable. Why? Well, maybe we can even describe why. Maybe you've got a lot of reasons. Maybe you've thought about that quite a bit. A world government. What does that mean? Well, that means we might have to give up some of who we are. That means we might have to give up some of our control over our own country. And those fears and anxieties that a world government might have for you are the same fears and anxieties that a citizen of the state of North Carolina had with the signing of the U.S. Constitution. And so states' rights, well, that's certainly a concern for people at this time. The other of these big issues was the national bank. And we'll get into more details with that in just a moment. Now, the issue of states' rights. I want to begin by discussing the Nullification Theory. The British tried to flood the United States with cheap goods. They were pulling Walmart's business strategy by driving American domestic industries out of business by outpricing them. To protect American businesses from the Walmart way, the United States raised tariffs, taxes on imports, making the British goods more expensive once more. However, consumers benefit from a price war. When you go to Walmart and you show a competitor's coupon, they will match it, guaranteed. If you can find something cheaper on Amazon, they dare you to find it, and they'll beat it every time. Well, that prevents Ma and Pa from opening up a store because they can't afford to sell things as cheap as Walmart can. And so that's why our government created protective tariffs to drive Walmart out of town, Walmart being the British at this point. But yet the consumer benefits from Walmart. The producer does not. So we feel bad for Ma and Pa stores, but we continue to buy our Chinese products. Why? Because they're cheaper. We feel bad. Well, that's what we're supposed to say. But we still buy the cheaper product. Southern states were the consumer at this time. Southern states purchasing British finished goods, be it textiles or tools or machines, any number of things. And because of these tariffs, those tools, machines, textiles, etc., were more expensive. Because you see, a tariff helps the producer but hurts the consumer. And the consumer, again, is the southern states. And that's why John C. Calhoun, representative from South Carolina, called the tariff of 1828 the tariff of abominations. Dun, 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 flames. Maybe you don't get the analogy. If you've read the book of Daniel, Daniel tells of a dark prophecy of the abomination of desolation, the rise of the Antichrist. But he uses the phrase, the abomination of desolation. And that was the metaphor that John C. Calhoun was making to an audience that had read the book of Daniel. and understood that he was calling the tariff Satan itself. Oh yeah, people were quite dramatic back in the old 1800s, just like they are today. He accused the accused the tariff of making the South pay for the North's prosperity. You see, cotton was already produced in the United States, and the South was producing the cheapest cotton in the world, so they didn't benefit from the tariff at all. And so Calhoun devised the Nullification Theory. And this is very important, because this theory is the legal basis that Southern states will try to use to secede from the Union. Here's the Nullification Theory. Number one, can federal laws be forced upon the states? Remember, that was the old problem of the Articles of Confederation, that federal laws could not technically be forced upon the states. And so he's going back to that same anti-federalist argument. Can federal laws be forced upon the states? And he questions that. Number two, he says the Constitution is a contract. He's quoting John Locke here, saying that it is a compact among the states, a contract. And that if a state feels that a law is unconstitutional, again, this is another argument from the Articles here, that if a state feels a law is unconstitutional, it should have the right to reject it. And that if that right is not granted to a state, that government has become tyrannical. And of course, what does John Locke say about tyrannical governments? We overthrow them. That's what the social contract is all about. That if a government becomes tyrannical, the people have the right to overthrow it. In this case, he was making the argument that if a federal government tries to force its will upon the states, that state has the right to leave the Union. And Southern states will use the Nullification Theory to justify secession in 1860. Because when Abraham Lincoln ran, he called slavery a vast moral evil. Southern states did not want slavery to become illegal. They saw Abraham Lincoln's election as a possible move towards emancipation or the outlawing of slavery. And they used that as their reasoning for seceding against the United States. Understanding this theory, it's big time, folks. This theory was debated in a series of famous debates called the Hane and Webster debates. In fact, one of your group projects coming up will be recreating this series of debates. Senator Robert Hane argued the Southern view of the tariff. He explained Calhoun's reasoning for calling this thing the devil itself. He also explained the Southern view of states' rights. Remember, the Anti-Federalists became the Democratic-Republican Party. And the Democratic-Republican Party became, for a time, the Democratic Party that we'll talk about before too long. And it was the Southern Democrats, these Anti-Federalists, who led secession, who had this view that Robert Hane expressed. Expressing the Northern view, or perhaps the pro-Union view, expressing the Federalist argument, was Daniel Webster, senator from Massachusetts, who defended the idea of union. President Andrew Jackson made the statement that our union, quote, must be preserved. And so Jackson used his executive authority to end the argument. We're not going to discuss this in the legislature. Our union must be preserved. And when Jackson ended the argument, Calhoun resigned. Meanwhile, South Carolina declared the tariff of 1828 as well as the next tariff in 1832 null and void, arguing that nullification gave them the right to reject a law they considered unfair, and they threatened to secede if the federal government tries to force them to obey this law. We've got a real problem here, folks. If you break a law, there is a consequence. If a group of people break a law, there is a consequence. If an entire state breaks a federal law, there is a consequence. In fact, Andrew Jackson pressured Congress to pass the force bill allowing the president to invade the state of South Carolina if they didn't back down. He was prepared to go in and do some killing over this issue. It wasn't just an argument in a classroom. These people were ready to fight and die over this issue. And so here comes Henry Clay, Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's like, whoa, guys, calm down. Everybody, chill out for a second. He was always known as the great compromiser. He came up with the American system. He hoped to really keep our country together. But, I mean, it's a difficult prospect at this time. It's like trying to hold a marriage that's falling apart. And that's what Henry Clay is trying to do. So he proposed, he's like, look, you have to obey the federal government. If we don't have that, we're not a country. So we're not just getting rid of this law because you whine a bunch. Remember, Britain did the same thing? When the Sons of Liberty started boycotting British products because of a series of taxes. And then they got rid of the Stamp Act, right? You're writing your essay about the Stamp Act. They said, we don't want the Stamp Act. So Britain said, okay, no more Stamp Act. But then they passed a law saying, you better do what we tell you to. And then they passed another tax. And then they said, you better take this one or else. So we effectively did the same thing to South Carolina that Britain did to us. The only difference is that South Carolina is a state with representatives in Congress who have a say and a vote in the laws that are passed. But as a state of the Union, South Carolina must submit to federal laws. So Henry Clay proposes a compromise. We are keeping this law. Federal law is the law of the land. But we get that you're freaking out. So we're going to make this law go away in 10 years. It's going to get a little bit smaller each time for 10 years. And so this compromise put off the American Civil War for another 32 years. So Henry Clay's got something going on. Imagine if you could prevent 500,000 deaths. What would you do to make that happen? Would you wiggle a little bit? Would you compromise? Would you give in? Ladies and gentlemen, that's the very same thing that Neville Chamberlain did to Hitler by appeasing. He said, okay, Hitler, take Czechoslovakia, do what you need to do. If we can prevent tens of millions of deaths by allowing freak show to take Czechoslovakia, again, that's what you have to do when you're in power. You have to make concessions, and you have to be willing to compromise. Moving on to the Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson just hated the Bank of the United States. Because though he believed our union must be preserved and he was willing to use force to back that statement up, he still saw the Bank of the United States as a tyrannical institution. In fact, when the charter was up for renewal of the Bank of the United States to create the second bank, he vetoed the charter. Jackson was very good at manipulating the media. He presented the bank as a privileged institution that benefited only the wealthy. You know, he called it a tool of the one percenters. That the wealthy were using the Bank of the United States for their own selfish ends. Jackson, after his veto, which effectively dismantled the Bank of the United States, said, we are going to have separate banks for each state. His critics called this Jackson's pet banks. Jackson was going to put federal money into state banks that were loyal to Jackson's party. Now, the president of the Bank of the United States, his name was Nicholas Biddle. He tried to maneuver to save the Bank of the United States from certain ruin. Because what Jackson was doing was taking our central financial institution that issued currency, that collected taxes, that paid our national debt, that served as the bedrock for our currency system, our entire system of exchange. And Jackson was tearing it up. And he literally said those words, the bank is trying to kill me, but I'm going to kill it. And by putting money into state banks, he's going to cause some major problems. In fact, many people saw the storm coming and were so dead set against him breaking up the Bank of the United States that they formed a new political party called the Whig Party. The idea of the Whig Party was to stand by the American system that Henry Clay had developed. And remember, Henry Clay's plan was based on a national currency. In fact, much of the debate between pet banks and a national bank is much of what's going on in Britain right now. What's that silly hashtag Britain's using to talk about their exit from the European Union? Anybody? Brexit? Have you heard of that one yet? So the Brexit in Britain is Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. They are having the very same discussion today that we are having about the 1820s. They didn't want to be tied to a national financial system with the entire Western European continent. They didn't want that. They wanted their own financial system. And so they voted on what's called Brexit to remove themselves from the euro. So yeah, Britain no longer uses the euro. That's effectively what Jackson is doing here with the National Bank. He said, South Carolina, you don't want to be a part of the U.S. dollar? Fine. Let's start a South Carolina dollar. Massachusetts, you don't want to be a part of the U.S. dollar? Fine. Start the Massachusetts dollar. And you can imagine how confusing that would get.
In the meantime, Congress is wrestling not only with South Carolina's nullification challenge, but with a controversy over the disposition of Western lands. These two issues provoke a series of debates on the floor of Congress between Robert Hane, a young senator from South Carolina, and Daniel Webster, the venerable Whig senator from Massachusetts.
And in these Hane-Webster debates, the two sides spelled out their views of what the Constitution was and whether it formed a permanent government or just a sort of loose association of voluntary states, with Webster, of course, arguing that the American Republic was a country that was indissoluble and that it could not be broken up. And, of course, Hane arguing the opposite, that true liberty demands that we be able to come and go as we please and we not be shackled to the will of some imaginary national majority.
No one is quite sure which side Jackson will take.
The party faithful had a dinner here in Washington at the Indian Queen Hotel on Thomas Jefferson's birthday, and everybody after dinner had to give a toast. Well, Senator Hane stood up and gave this long discursive ramble in which he basically justified his course with Webster. And then everybody looked at Andrew Jackson. What are you going to say? And Jackson stood up and he held up his glass of wine and he said, "Our Union, it must be preserved." He didn't say anything more than that, but it was like this slap in the face to South Carolina. Calhoun, despite that amendment, had to make some kind of reply, and he stood up, and he was shaking with fury, so much so that his wine glass was shaking, and some of the wine dribbled down the glass, and he was groping for his words. And he said, "The Union, next to our liberties, the most dear." And so he had thrown down the gauntlet back.
Andrew Jackson, as president, said, "I'm elected to enforce the law, and therefore I will hang the first person to the first tree who breaks the first law, and if that be John C. Calhoun, so much the better." He was raising essentially an invasion fleet in New York to sail into Charleston Harbor and blast the city into smithereens if necessary. In the midst of this, Calhoun resigned as vice president, the first person ever to do so, in order to take up the Senate seat of a South Carolina senator who had died. And then Calhoun and Henry Clay were able to work out a compromise that revised the tariff downward over a period of 10 years, and everything's wonderful. Jackson, of course, didn't have to invade South Carolina. South Carolinians met in convention and repealed the Nullification Act. So I think a lot of people saved face, but nobody learned much.
Years later, President Jackson is asked as he is leaving office,
"Do you have any regrets?" "I regret that I didn't shoot Henry Clay or hang John C. Calhoun." I just find the drama irresistible, not only because I like drama, but because I think that was a period in our history. And again, we're talking about the period after the War of 1812 up to the 1850s, when these issues were huge but dramatic. I mean, there's a certain kind of drama today, but it's all manufactured. But at that time, apparently newspapers were passed from hand to hand. There were stump speakers. It was a restrictive, right? Anti-black, anti-Native American, anti-immigrant. Women were not included. I would never make a claim that it was democratic in the sense of full participation, but it was democratic in many other ways, popular, a little vulgar, and oratory.
The Jackson administration may promote broader involvement in government, but its purpose seems less to help farmers and laborers or the truly disenfranchised than to challenge Eastern elites. Jackson and his followers like the power they've achieved, and they'll continue to use it with little regard for anyone who stands in their way.
Oh my gosh. Those guys did a great job of explaining the Hane-Webster debate. You know, think of it as a dinner party. And again, if you choose this as your group, you would be simulating this. So you might want to have some kind of fake dinner party. And Robert Hane is going to get up and present the Southern view. And he's going to go off on this tirade about blah, 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 states' rights, tariff, everything's evil, federal government's bad, we just want to do our own thing, and the world can burn. And then, of course, Daniel Webster is going to, and think of how awkward this is at a dinner party, is going to try to contradict this long tirade that this Southern politician has went on about how, no, federalism is good. You know, think of the federalism, anti-federalist commercials that you made. He's going to say, no, national unity. Like, that's what we're all about, right? We're a country. You know, indivisible with liberty and justice for all, right? Huh? And then Andrew Jackson, president, by the way, is going to get up and he's going to shut everybody down. I mean, this is like epic rap battle. Just by saying, our union must be preserved. Boom. But Calhoun has to have the last word. He's just that guy at the dinner table. He can't let well enough alone. And I never knew that until I watched that clip, that he actually stood up and he was just visibly shaking. Again, I mean, you just need to recreate. It would be so fun for one of y'all to do this. Just get up shaking, just like, you know, if you ever get that angry or that passionate about something, I know I have, where I'm just, my body is shaking. My words become just kind of flaky a little bit. And he gets up and he says, our union next to our liberties. It's a powerful statement. Because he says, our states' rights are more important than us staying together as a country. Think of a husband and wife. They're estranged, sleeping in separate bedrooms. Each spouse has developed their own different life, their own habits, their own friends. You know, and then at that point, one of the two tries to bring each other back together. Maybe it's something simple. Hey, what are you doing this weekend? Let's do something together. And then the husband says, no, I'm going to play baseball with my friends. And they said, no, come to the movies with me. Come on. It'll be fun. It'll just be us. Our union next to my baseball. Right? I'm playing baseball with my friends. You go watch the movie by yourself if that's what you want to do. That's the conversation we're having on a national level. Okay? Meanwhile, Jackson retires. He's done his 2 terms. He's done. He was so popular, this guy, that he appoints his successor. Remember King Andrew? Yeah. He was so popular, the man he endorsed for president, Martin Van Buren, won with the support of Andrew Jackson. But meanwhile, this problem with the banks. Each state's bank printing its own money with no good federal control. And they began to print more money than they had actual currency to back it up. And when the federal government began to demand actual currency, since states started printing their own currency, the only real national currency for this period of time was gold or silver. And so the federal government began to demand gold and silver to pay for public lands. And so the banks didn't have enough gold or silver to back up their paper money. And there was a rush on the banks. And this caused a panic, called the Panic of 1837. Banks closed because people realized that the banks were printing money that was worthless. And so people went to the banks and said, I'd like my money in gold, please. And the banks said, sorry, we don't have enough gold. The banks actually closed their doors. And when the banks close their doors, that means that means your money is worth nothing. Because the banks are what make your money worth anything. And when the banks closed, the financial system collapsed. More than a third of the population was out of work. Some people lost everything. Many businesses were bankrupted. And Martin Van Buren inherited the problem that Andrew Jackson created. And he's not going to be reelected.
Shortly after Martin Van Buren was sworn in as president in 1837, the year Michigan became a state, an economic disaster struck the nation. The Panic of 1837 resulted from the abrupt closure of a large number of American banks. These bank failures plunged the United States into the first major depression, or severe economic downturn in its history. But the disaster President Van Buren confronted was not of his making and can be traced back to the actions of his predecessor, Andrew Jackson. For Jackson had attempted to destroy the Bank of the United States, the well-established private bank that handled the money of the federal government, and that was run by his political enemies. This bank also oversaw the activities of America's small state banks. Jackson used his power as president to veto, that is, override, the law that allowed the Bank of the United States to operate, and he ordered that all the government's money be withdrawn from it. As a result, responsible oversight of the activities of America's banking industry was lost. Jackson's actions made it much easier for banks to make risky loans to unscrupulous land speculators, people who bought and sold government land to make a profit. In the 1830s, small banks issued their own paper money to make loans. It was supposed to be backed up with gold or silver equal to its face value, but it rarely was. Banks make money by charging interest fees for loans. The more loans they make, the more interest they are paid. But back then, the amount of paper money the banks loaned out greatly exceeded their gold and silver reserves. When ordinary American citizens heard about this situation, they panicked and tried to withdraw their money from the banks as gold or silver coins. But the bankers either offered them worthless paper money or else turned them away. Soon the banks shut down. People lost their life savings. Businesses failed. Unemployment soared. And soon the entire American economy collapsed. President Van Buren was blamed for not fixing the nation's money problems. And in the election of 1840, Van Buren, a Democrat, was defeated in a landslide by William Henry Harrison, a member of the Whig Party, a political party originally formed to oppose Andrew Jackson. However, in April of 1841, after only 1 month in office, Harrison, the 9th U.S. president, died of pneumonia, and as specified by law, his vice president, John Tyler, automatically became the 10th president of the United States.
All right, so Martin Van Buren inherited a serious problem, a great financial collapse, which led to a financial depression. You don't tend to get reelected when things like that happen, even if it's not your fault. So the Whig candidate, remember the Whig Party had formed in opposition to Andrew Jackson. That candidate was William Henry Harrison. Hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. I know you know all about that one. Well, he was a hero of his time for defeating Tecumseh and the Shawnee. Harrison was rather successful. He hoped or promised to enact the Whig program to restore the Bank of the United States, resume the American system, and revitalize the economy. Yet he didn't live long enough to see his plans come to fruition. In fact, he died of pneumonia 1 month after becoming president. This man served as president of the United States for the shortest period of time in American history. He was president for a month, and then he died. Yeah. Now, what would have happened if he had lived? Maybe his plan would have been successful. Who knows? He was succeeded by his vice president, John Tyler. Now, Tyler was not quite as adamant about the Whig economic plan of restoring the Bank of the United States, but people really care what Tyler had to say. In fact, he was nicknamed his accidency because he was never actually elected president and because he was never reelected. So he's one of these people who was never truly elected president of the United States. And you don't tend to get a lot of support if you don't have an election showing that people are behind you to back you up. And I just wanted for fun here to show you, this is William Henry Harrison's campaign poster. Notice he's standing next to kegs of whiskey, and he was elected president. Yeah, so hard cider and log cabin almanac showing candidate for president, Whig Henry Harrison, on an ad for hard cider. Anyway, it was meant to show that he was a man of the people. All right, so what was this famous debate that we talked about today all about? Who can tell me? Who thinks it's A? Okay, B, C, or D? All right, the B's have it. States' rights.